All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know how it is you're here because you want to get smarter and faster on stuff that really matters. And hopefully you're here for a few of those like aha moments too. You know what I mean? But all without like feeling overwhelmed.
Like just drowning in info.
Totally. And you know what? Today, that's exactly what we're going to do as we take a deep dive into understanding and influencing your mental well-being. And we're doing this deep dive by looking at the work of Dr. Julie Smith.
Yeah, a really great source.
Yeah. And what's really cool about Dr. Smith is she's a clinical psychologist. So she's got years of experience. And what's really valuable about her work, and especially her book, is that it really aims to give you like a concrete set of tools and techniques for you, the listener, to use. So it's kind of less like, traditional therapy, where you're like digging into the past and more like building this like mental health.
First aid kit.
Yes.
For like everyday life.
Yes, exactly.
Love that.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really extract those key actionable strategies from Dr. Smith's book. So you can start like thinking about them, potentially implementing them to build your resilience and kind of learn how to manage your mood a little bit more effectively.
Definitely.
And as Dr. Smith emphasizes in her book, like this isn't about like eliminating difficult emotions entirely,
No.
which is unrealistic.
Yeah, you're going to feel.
You're human. You're going to feel things.
Right.
It's more about understanding them and learning how to work with them in a healthy way.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that she talks about that I think is so important to start off with is this concept of like a two-way road
Yes.
between your thoughts and your feelings.
Yeah.
So it's not just that what you think affects how you feel,
Right.
which I feel like a lot of us know. You have a thought and then you might feel something as a result of that. But what's really, I think, less obvious is how your feelings in the moment
Yes.
can shape the kinds of thoughts that pop up.
Yes.
So when you are feeling low, you are more vulnerable to negative self-talk.
It's so true because when you're in a negative headspace,
Yeah.
it's almost impossible to shift to a more positive mindset, and Dr. Smith talks about how hard that actually is
Yeah.
to think differently when you're feeling down. And she really emphasizes the importance of recognizing what keeps you stuck in those cycles versus the actions and perspectives that actually help you get out of them. So
it's not just like think positive, because that doesn't always work.
no, it doesn't. And I think it's important to remember that your emotional state isn't just some abstract thing happening up in your mind. It's all connected to your physical sensations. It's connected to the thoughts that you're having, the things you're doing. So really, like, it's all intertwined.
Yeah.
The good news is that those are all areas that you can kind of, take a little bit of control of.
Yeah. So what are some things that we can actually do?
Well, Dr. Smith introduces this really great tool called a cross-sectional formulation. And it's basically like a snapshot, like a photograph of how you're feeling in the moment.
Okay.
And by looking at different areas of your life, your body, your thoughts, your actions, maybe the situation that you're in, are there any unmet needs, all these different things that might be contributing to how you're feeling in this moment.
Okay.
You can really identify those things. Instead of just saying like, oh, I feel bad, it's more like, well, what's actually going on?
Right. So it's like looking at everything all at once to kind of see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And actually in the book, Dr. Smith gives you like a blank formulation to actually use.
Oh, cool.
It's really cool.
That's very helpful. So once you kind of get a picture of everything that's going on, then Dr. Smith focuses on identifying and managing these unhelpful negative thought patterns we all have. And she talks about thought biases.
Yes.
Which are basically, I like to think of them as like mental shortcuts.
Yeah, like patterns in our thinking.
Yeah, that can just get like really amplified when our mood is low. And the thing is, everyone experiences them.
It's totally normal.
Like it's a normal part of being human. It's just that when you're feeling down, they can really intensify those negative emotions.
Exactly.
And it's harder to see clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you're in it.
And to make it a little bit more specific, Dr. Smith really outlines common thinking traps that we all fall into when we're not feeling our best. And I'm sure a lot of these will sound familiar. So one of them is mind reading.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure we've all done this, where you assume you know what someone else is thinking or feeling without any evidence.
Yeah.
So, for example, she hasn't replied to my text message. She must be angry with me.
Yeah. Or like they didn't wave back. They must hate me. All those kinds of things.
Exactly. And what's so interesting is that Dr. Smith, recommends curiosity Instead of jumping to that negative conclusion like, oh, they must be angry with me,
Right.
why not get curious and be like, huh, I wonder what's going on with them? Or even reach out and ask.
Yeah, because that assumption that the other person is angry, that can really just shut down communication, and then you just feel worse.
Absolutely.
But curiosity, like you said, keeps those possibilities open.
Yes.
Another one that I think we can all relate to is overgeneralization. So this is where you take one negative event and then you apply it broadly to other situations that may or may not even be related.
Exactly. So you fail one task and you think, oh, I always mess things up. I'm just not capable.
Yeah.
Like you said, you take one instance and you just assume it's a pattern of failure.
And I think it's so easy to do that because one bad experience can really color your entire outlook.
Absolutely.
And then there's emotional reasoning.
Ooh.
This one's a tricky one because it's basically when you believe something must be true because you feel it so strongly.
Right. So it's like after a presentation, you might think, oh my God, that was terrible. Even if like people are coming up to you afterwards and like giving you good feedback, but you just feel.
You feel it.
You just feel like you bombed.
Yeah.
And so you believe that that must be true. So really your feelings become the facts, even when they might not be true.
Yeah. I like how you said that. So it's like your feelings become your facts.
Yes. Even when they might not align with reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah.
Okay. What else? What other thinking traps do we have?
So another big one is the mental filter. And this is where you really laser focus on the negative parts of a situation. And you just ignore anything positive.
It's like you have blinders on to the good stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, you have a sieve and only the bad stuff gets through. And then there's disqualifying the positive.
Yes. I know that one.
So you experience something good or someone pays you a compliment. And then you're like, oh, no, there's just being polite. Or, oh, I only did well because I got lucky.
Right. It's like you can't take the compliment.
You can't let yourself.
Or like you can't let it affect you.
Right. You can't let the positive experience actually make you feel good about yourself.
Ugh, yeah.
Then we have jumping to conclusions.
Okay.
Which includes mind reading, which we've already talked about. But also like fortune telling.
Yeah.
So this is where you just predict negative outcomes for the future.
Oh, yeah.
Without any evidence.
Right.
So it's like, I'm going to fail that test or, oh, I'm going to mess up that interview.
And there's no reason to think that that would happen.
Exactly.
We're just creating this narrative.
Yeah. And then there's magnification and minimization.
Okay.
And this is where you blow negative events way out of proportion. And you downplay the positive ones.
So it's like using a microscope on your mistakes and then a telescope on your successes.
Yeah.
But like in reverse.
Yes, exactly.
It's like the opposite of what you want to be doing.
Yes.
So we want to minimize those mistakes.
Yes.
And magnify those successes. It's exactly.
So labeling, I think, is another one that a lot of people can relate to, where you're just assigning like a rigid and negative label to yourself based on one event or characteristic.
Exactly. So instead of thinking I made a mistake, it's like I'm an idiot.
Yeah.
Or I'm a failure. And that label just becomes, part of how you see yourself.
And that can be really damaging, I think.
Absolutely.
So we want to be really careful about the labels that we give ourselves.
Yes.
Another common one is personalization. And I think this happens a lot where you blame yourself for external events that you had no control over.
Right. So for example, like the project failed because of me. Yeah. Because I didn't work hard enough.
Right. When really there were like a million other things going on that contributed to that.
And then there's egocentric thinking. So this is assuming that everyone sees things from your perspective. And then judging them based on that assumption.
Oh, yeah.
So for example, if a friend is late, you might think, oh, they don't care about my time.
Without considering any other possible reasons why they might be late.
Right.
And I think a lot of people do that, where they think that everyone is thinking about them.
Yeah. It's kind of an ego thing.
Yeah. It's very ego-driven.
Thinking that everyone is thinking about you all the time.
Exactly.
So another one. She talks about musts and shoulds. And I think, these are those rigid expectations that we put on ourselves and often unrealistic expectations.
Right. It's like that voice in your head that's like, I must always be productive. I should never feel anxious. And, it sets us up for failure.
Yeah. Because no one is going to be productive 100% of the time.
Right.
And like anxiety is a normal human emotion.
Exactly.
We're all going to feel it.
Yeah.
And the last one she talks about is all or nothing thinking, where you're just seeing things in black and white.
Yes.
No gray area.
Yeah. There's no nuance. It's either this or that.
Right. So if you don't achieve something perfectly.
Right.
you see yourself as a complete failure. And Dr. Smith explains that while this might give us like a false sense of certainty, when we're stressed out, because it's like we know either we're going to do this or we're not, it can prevent us from seeing the complexity of situations.
Right. And like the nuances of life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was a lot of thought biases. But what's important to remember is that they're not facts. They're just thoughts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the power of those thoughts really comes down to how much you believe them.
Right.
How much you buy into them.
Yeah. And we can learn how to identify and manage those thought biases.
Yes.
So what are some of the things that we can do?
Well, the first thing is to actually just become aware of them as they happen. Because once you can notice them, you can start to create a little bit of distance from them and recognize that they're just one possible interpretation, not necessarily the truth.
Okay. So it's about creating space between you and the thought.
Exactly.
Kind of look at it objectively and say, is this really true?
Exactly. And she recommends, using distance language. So instead of saying, I am a failure, it would be more helpful to say, I am having the thought that I am a failure. So it's that subtle shift in the language that can really help.
That's really interesting.
And I think it really helps to share, your common thought biases with someone you trust.
Yeah.
So whether that's a friend or family member, maybe it's the therapist, sometimes those people can spot those patterns a little bit more easily because they're seeing it from the outside, and they can help you become more aware of them.
Right. But like you've mentioned before, this takes having like a really supportive and non-judgmental relationship with that person.
Absolutely. And mindfulness can be so helpful too. Even just taking, 5 or 10 minutes a day can really help you start to observe your thoughts without judgment. And it really allows you to, separate yourself from them so you're not getting carried away with them. It's almost like thinking about them from, the sky, looking down.
Yeah, like you're a detached observer.
Exactly.
Of your own thought.
Right. Which can give you a little bit more control. Know about where you focus your attention.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's like you're choosing what to focus on.
Yes.
Rather than letting your thoughts control you.
Right. And then, Dr. Smith really emphasizes actively looking for a more balanced perspective.
Okay.
To those biased thoughts. So instead of, having the thought that I'm a failure, it's like, okay, well, what's a more balanced perspective on this? I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean I'm a failure as a human being.
Right. And she says that the exact wording isn't as important as just like the actual act of stopping and considering other viewpoints. And I think that is so key because it's so easy to get stuck in your own head.
Absolutely.
And just think that your perspective is the only perspective.
Right.
And I think that can lead to a lot of problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when we open our minds to other possibilities, it can really help us to see things more objectively. Yes.
Okay, so we talked about these negative thought patterns. But what happens when those thoughts just keep replaying over and over and over in your mind, like a broken record? So that's when Dr. Smith talks about rumination.
Yeah. And she describes it as like, your thoughts are going through like a washing machine. They're just going round and round and round.
And it just makes you feel worse.
Right. And it can be so hard to break out of that cycle. And as we talked about earlier, when you combine rumination with those negative thought biases, it's like it just intensifies and really prolongs feelings of distress. So one thing that Dr. Smith suggests is to ask yourself a really simple question. And the question is, what would I do if I was at my best?
I like that.
And I think that's such a helpful question because it doesn't expect you to like all of a sudden feel good when you're not. It really just kind of shifts your focus to envisioning where you want to go. Even if it's just taking one small step.
Right. So if you are in a negative spiral, thinking about a situation that is really upsetting to you, asking yourself, what would I do if I was at my best? Or what would I do if I was coping well? Can kind of help you shift your perspective and move away from that rumination.
So instead of dwelling on the problem, you're thinking about potential solutions.
Exactly.
Even if those solutions are small.
Yeah, and it's not even about solutions necessarily. It's just more about shifting your focus to positive action. So that could be something really simple, like going for a walk, taking a break, calling a friend.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of us forget to do when we're feeling overwhelmed is to actually reach out for help.
Absolutely. It can be so hard to do, when you're not feeling good.
Yeah.
But connecting with other people can really make a huge difference. And it's something that Dr. Smith really emphasizes, that human connection can make a big difference in, reducing rumination.
Yeah.
Because when you're talking to somebody else,
Yeah.
you're getting that outside perspective, and they might reflect back something that you're not seeing.
Right. And then it gets you out of your head, which I think is so key.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about all this, kind of psychological stuff
Mm-hmm.
that we can do
Right.
to help us manage our moods, but we can't forget about the basics.
Yes. So true.
So Dr. Smith talks about how neglecting those really foundational elements of well-being, it's like, you're playing in a sports game and you have the best players, but you're leaving out all the defensive players.
You're just going to get scored on.
Yeah. So these basic self-care practices are like those defensive players. They protect us and they make us more resilient. But so often, they are the first things to slide when we are not feeling good.
Right. And when we're feeling down, it can feel so hard to prioritize those things.
Yeah.
But they're really the foundation for everything else.
So what are some of those foundational elements that we need to make sure that we are paying attention to?
Well, exercise is one of them. I mean, the evidence is so strong. You know how beneficial exercise is for our mental health? It really has a huge antidepressant effect. It helps boost your mood by increasing dopamine and your overall ability to, experience pleasure. And studies have even shown that exercise can actually enhance the effectiveness of antidepressant medication.
Wow. So it's like powerful medicine.
It really is. And I think sleep is another one.
Yeah, sleep is so important.
And it has such a strong two-way relationship with our mental health. When we're feeling down, our sleep tends to suffer.
Right.
And then when we're not getting good sleep, our mood and our ability to cope with stress really takes a hit.
So it's like a vicious cycle.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so what are some things that we can do to make sure that we're getting enough sleep, or to at least, improve our chances of getting good sleep?
Well, Dr. Smith gives some really practical tips for improving sleep hygiene, like keeping the lights dim in the evening,
Okay.
Reducing screen brightness,
Yeah.
trying to switch off, phones, tablets, laptops, ideally an hour or two before bed, which I know can be really hard, but it can make such a difference. And addressing any worries you might have before bed, like writing them down in a journal or making a list.
Yeah.
That can really help to kind of get them out of your head.
Yeah, because when you're lying in bed and your mind is racing, it's almost impossible to fall asleep.
Exactly.
But if you've already kind of processed them, or at least gotten them out of your head, it can really help.
Yes. And then avoiding caffeine and large meals late in the evening.
Okay.
And she really emphasizes focusing on creating a relaxing bedtime routine rather than just trying to force yourself to sleep.
Right. So it's about setting the stage for good sleep.
Exactly.
Rather than like stressing about it. Okay, so we've talked about exercise, we've talked about sleep. What else?
Nutrition.
Of course.
Which I think a lot of times we forget about. But Dr. Smith really emphasizes that, there's a powerful link between what we eat and how we feel.
Yeah.
And research has actually shown that, improving your diet can have a really positive impact on symptoms of depression and may even help prevent mental health conditions from developing.
Wow. So it's like, it's not just about like, looking good or feeling good physically.
Right.
But like it actually impacts our mental health as well.
It really does. And while she says that there's no one perfect diet,
Yeah.
the diets that tend to be most beneficial for our mental health. So things like, the Mediterranean diet, the Norwegian diet, the Japanese diet, they all kind of emphasize similar things like, whole unprocessed foods, healthy fats, whole grains. And that's kind of a common thread between a lot of those diets that are beneficial for our mental health. Yeah.
So it's not just about what we're eating, but it's also about like having a routine.
Yeah.
Dr. Smith talks about how important it is to have a routine. And I think that a lot of us can relate to that.
Right.
Where, when we have that predictability in our days, it just makes us feel calmer and less stressed.
Right.
But she also talks about how important it is to make sure that we're not just like stuck in a rut, and that we're also incorporating novelty and adventure into our lives. So it's like having that balance between predictability and, some excitement.
Yeah.
And finally, she also emphasizes human connection as being like the most powerful thing that we can do to maintain good mental health. And she talks about, how that urge to withdraw and isolate ourselves when we are feeling low can be a real trap, because then you're just like alone with your thoughts, and that can spiral. But if we actively reach out and connect with others, even if we don't feel like it, it can have a huge positive impact on our mood.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember that, offering support to other people actually has positive effects for both the giver and the receiver. So it's not just about, being on the receiving end of support, but it's also about giving support to others.
Right. Because when you're helping other people, it takes your mind off of your own problems, and it just makes you feel good.
Exactly. And sometimes just, being in the presence of other people, even if you're not talking, can be uplifting.
Right. Okay, so another area that she focuses on is understanding and nurturing our motivation. And I think, she makes a really important distinction that motivation isn't a fixed feeling.
Right.
It comes and goes.
It ebbs and flows.
Yeah. And often motivation follows action, not the other way around. So a lot of times we think, we need to feel motivated in order to do something. But that's actually not how it works. A lot of times we need to just start doing the thing, and then the motivation will come.
It's like we need to take a small step, and then we'll start to feel motivated to keep going.
Yeah. So it's not like motivation is this like magical thing that just appears out of nowhere. Right. It's something that we can cultivate by taking action. And Dr. Smith talks about mastering motivation as the ability to do what matters even when you don't feel like doing it.
Right. So it's really about being able to, just show up even when you're not feeling it.
Yeah. And she also talks about procrastination and links it to our tendency to avoid things that cause us stress or discomfort. And she defines anhedonia, which is like this loss of pleasure in activities you once enjoyed, which is often a symptom of low mood.
Right.
And her message is really clear here, which is that if something matters for your well-being, try to do it even when you don't feel like it, which can be really hard.
It can.
When you're not feeling it.
Yeah. And she talks about this idea of, acting opposite to the urge, especially when the urge is to do something that isn't good for you.
Right.
So, for example, if you're feeling stressed and, you want to reach for a bag of chips or, pour yourself a drink or something like that, it's really about, being mindful of that urge, pausing, and then saying, okay, what can I do that's actually going to help me in this moment that's aligned with my values? So maybe instead of reaching for a bag of chips, you go for a walk, or you call a friend, or you meditate.
Right. So it's about having that pause.
Yeah.
To kind of choose how you're going to respond.
Exactly. And she also talks about this idea of a pain barrier when it comes to building new habits.
Okay. So what is that?
So the idea is that, when we do something over and over again, it creates, like stronger pathways in our brain, making those actions feel easier. But when we're starting something new, it requires a lot of effort.
Yeah.
And especially when we're under stress, our brain really defaults to those easy, well-worn paths. It's like, walking through a forest and there's a path that's been there for a long time versus having to forge a new path through the woods. It's going to be a lot harder to forge that new path.
Right.
But if you keep walking that path over and over,